welcome to Exceptional TV. My name is Karen Judd Smith, and it's time to journey briefly to the jungles of Colombia, the shores of Yemen, and then back to the streets of the USA. And we're going to do this with today's guest, James Patton. He's the CEO of the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. Now, James will take us into his world to explore religion and how it may heal or exacerbate identity divides. But first of all, I want to say welcome to Exceptional TV, James.
Thank you so much. Thanks for doing this, Karen. This is a great opportunity, and I really appreciate your interest in and support of the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy and the work that we do. So thanks again.
Well, the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy, in my humble opinion, is quite exceptional and is one of the voices that I have so wanted to help be brought to many more people for years. And so I think this is going to give us a chance to really, perhaps for me to prove myself right, I don't know, but we definitely want to hear from you. Now, to me, James is one of today's thought leaders. He's an innovator. He's a visionary change maker. And he's the president and CEO of the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy, as he mentioned. And I know that he's conducted international development, conflict transformation, and social reconciliation for over 2 decades. There's probably a little story in your beard. And you've been building collaborative networks and programs with an entire spectrum of social and political actors. And I know that, you know, these are just words, but when you get into the details of what it means to work with political actors in all different kinds of situations, these are some of the bits that I'm hoping that you will be able to bring out with us and share with us, James, as we hear some of the real stories behind the stories. I know you have your outcomes, but then the way to getting to that is challenging. So we'll get to that. So let's start for a moment with you. You are here now, the CEO, but you didn't start here. Tell us how you got to where you are. Tell us a little bit about your story.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for asking. And of course, the story in the beard is probably the gray that's coming out in it these days. You know, it's a real marker of transition for me that when I do let it grow out, it's grayer and grayer every time. So I guess that comes with the territory. It's a great question. How did I get here? I mean, I sort of took a very circuitous route, frankly. I mean, I did my undergraduate work in art and in philosophy and in things that had very little to do with the kind of work that I do now. And then I decided to join the Peace Corps. And I, from the University of Connecticut, which is the state in which I grew up, and found myself deposited in rural Paraguay in South America and working as a beekeeper. So I went from art classes and literature and philosophy classes and things like that, and I did some biology when I was there as well, to all of a sudden being in the middle of a mostly Guarani-speaking community with very limited knowledge of Spanish or Guarani and very limited knowledge of beekeeping, training community members on how to raise Africanized killer bees for honey as an alternative income source. So really, that's kind of where my career started. In a way, that had such a massive impact on who I was and how I knew myself, as well as how I came to understand what lived community was like. You know, in a place like Paraguay, where there's, you know, it's a very poor country, and in the rural areas in particular, the resources are very scarce. People come to really depend on one another in ways that I think, you know, we don't see as much in the United States. So community just means something very different. And I really learned a lot about that and what it meant. While I was there, I also was able to...
What was the time frame of your adjustment, could you say?
How long did it take me to adjust?
Well, yeah. As
to being the,
yeah.
I'm still adjusting. I'm still badly adjusted. I think, in a lot of ways, all the time that I spent abroad makes you kind of homeless in some fashion. I came back from that experience a very different person when I left, and so I never fully belonged there, even though the people are exceptional. I love the Paraguayans. They're such hospitable people and such happy people. But you come back changed, and you don't quite fit where you were when you left, and you don't quite fit wherever you go. So in a way, I've become the perpetual wanderer, and that's marked a lot of how I've done what I've done, and how I've kind of lived my life. But while, one of the things that happened to me down in Paraguay was I got really exposed to these questions of social justice, and even the relationship people had with religion and theology around questions of social justice. You probably know that Latin America suffered quite a bit during the 80s. The liberation theologians got very involved in the justice movements around the violence, particularly in Central America. And so just reading on these things and getting exposed to these concepts about economic and social justice in places where people were really struggling, it piqued my interest, and it made me wonder about the role of faith and the role of religion in people's lives. And I came back to the States trying to answer the question about, how does this aspect of human experience, which is so profound and so pervasive, how can it simultaneously inspire some extraordinary selfless acts and behaviors, reconciliation with others in the face of violence that would justify, the desire for vengeance and retribution? But how can it also simultaneously be used to justify and even compel people to do horrible things to one another, and to really create a dehumanizing image of others who are from different identity groups and faith traditions, and use divine sort of compulsion to justify these horrible acts of violence and even genocide. And I was really curious about this, and I saw this kind of schizophrenia in faith, and then I ended up coming back and going to the Harvard Divinity School and to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy simultaneously, to study that, but also look at how this manifests in communities around social justice issues. I like to say I fell in with the wrong crowd. I got back and I met a bunch of Jesuit liberation theologians, and I had been, I grew up a Catholic. I was an ex-Catholic at the time, and these gents really kind of inspired me to shift my idea of the way you can relate to religion and religious doctrine and religious language. I had found it somewhat oppressive when I was younger, and they kind of helped me open myself to the idea that
what was the shift?
Well, the liberation theologians are really kind of grounded in this idea, if I can simplify it, that their concept of the kingdom, the divine kingdom, is one that inspires them to create justice in the spaces that they have influence in, right? You look at writers like John Sobrino, for example, who talks about, finding the crucified people and taking them down off the cross as, using Christian imagery as something that they are compelled to do as believers. And so it wasn't the theology of my youth, which was really kind of focused on, the afterlife and heaven and purgatory and things that just I couldn't really ground myself in. It was a theology of doing something in the world, having an impact as you pass through the world, that really manifests what they see as divine principles, and these are principles that are shot through all of human faith traditions, and are not the property of any particular faith tradition. Frankly, I feel that most of our faiths have erupted from this desire to understand and elevate the best of who we can be, or the divine in ourselves. As you know, I self-describe now as a Quaker, and the Quakers are very much oriented around this idea of identifying and elevating the light of the divine in each person, and that transcends religious identity. It transcends any identity, frankly, whether people are people of faith or not. This is a truth that there is that of the divine in each, or if you want to put it in non-religious language, you know, there are better angels of our nature and lesser angels of our nature, although I guess that's still religious language. Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, no, I just want to draw out a couple of things here. So the shift that you transitioned from of religion in your youth, going to Paraguay, etc., and then as you came back and studied further, then you began. How would you describe that shift? I mean, other than, yeah, I know you gave me that description through the lens of theology, but in terms of just you as a human, what do you think happened to you? How would you describe that?
I guess I would say I became aware of my own spirit. And how do I mean that? You know, we hear a lot about spirit and spirituality, both in and out of religious traditions, right? And I think I started to reflect on, really, you know, for me, what does that mean? What is the spirit of someone's life, right? What is our spirit? And for me, that manifests in relationship. The idea that as we move through the world, we interact with and have impact on things and people, whether it's the environment around us or other individuals, communities, or even with ourselves. And this is something that you'll see, again, across faith traditions, this idea that, you know, as we act, there is an impact there. It goes beyond who we are as individuals, and really it manifests in relationship. And those can be healing and compassionate and constructive interactions and relationships, or they can be harming ones. Mm-hmm. And that spirit of people's existence and their passage through the world, and the wake that you leave as you pass through this world is there whether you are aware of it or not. And I think faith traditions, in my experience, the best of faith is that which gets us to increase our attentiveness to that and our ownership of it, frankly, and to try to constantly improve upon how we are passing through this existence and what that passage does. You know, what is it that happens when we touch others, and in terms of their attitudes and their feelings and their emotions and their actions towards others, there's this ripple effect, right?
Right.
So I think it was really just kind of a heightened awareness of the fact that I needed to understand and own that.
And I hear you talking many times saying, you know, as we pass through. So, and you also mentioned the term ownership. Now I'm just pulling out little threads here. But ownership is one thing. Passing through is a transitional thing. It's not a control, not a sense of control. Ownership has got that sense of control or owning, and passing through doesn't. So you see a real dynamic between those two in life? Between control?
I would use the term agency, right? I think, you know, the passing through is certainly something that you have agency over. You know, in our work, you know, for example, we work on reconciliation issues, and reconciliation is really grounded in the idea that regardless of what you've done up until now, you still have agency over your next move. You know, regardless of how you've walked through the world, that next footfall, where you place yourself in the next moment, is still something that you have control and agency over. And therefore, it can actually be different from what you have done in the past. And this idea of separating the individual and their identity and their capacity in relationship with others from their history. And that's not to ignore the history. You have to depart from that history. You have to acknowledge that history, work from the impact of that history. But the idea that they can be different than that history going forward is essential to the kind of work that we do on conflict transformation and reconciliation. If it were not possible for someone to take agency and control over that passage. And so I see what you're saying is there's kind of the static, and then there's the transitional or relational, but I don't see those as distinct, right? It's sort of like, oftentimes we'll hear kind of false dichotomies in this space around things like the ideal and the real. Are you an idealist or are you a realist? And I think it's similar to what you're asking. These are not oppositional ideas, right? I mean, the ideal is where you hope to get, and the real is those are the steps you take in order to move in that direction. You may never get to the ideal, but you have to own both that concept of what do I believe in and where do I see myself eventually being, who do I want to be, and then how do I take the steps to get there, right? And so they are very much in a relationship with one another, this concept of agency and movement and ownership.
And so then all of these dynamics that you were talking about, you see that is placed into your work. So let's tell us a little bit about the work you do and how this concept of agency and ownership. And I agree that intellectually we separate things in order to kind of have a rational view of things, but that's a piece of the pie. It's not reality in and of itself. It's just the way it helps us. Hopefully it helps us understand and become better agents. But tell us a little bit about how these play into the work that you do, and a little bit more about the work this is too big a question, the work that you have done and the work you are doing. Because I know you've done some amazing work in the past, and that has informed the work you're doing now. But let's mostly focus on the work that you are doing now. So how do all of these elements play into that work, and what is it?
Yeah, sure. Well, first I should say, when I was in undergraduate, before some of the stuff we were just talking about, I was really in a group, in a crowd that was kind of politically and socially skeptical of the role of religion in the world, right? Right. But as you know, that there are, I guess Pew Research a few years back came out with a statistic that said 84% of the global population self-describes as religious in some way. And so in truth, religion is in the room whether you want it to be in the room or not. This is, more than 6 billion human beings on this planet take some sort of spiritual and interpersonal and community and ethical and moral guide from a faith tradition. So it's undeniable that this is part of why people behave the way they do with one another. So it has to be taken seriously, right? That's one thing that I think is really important. And so what we do is we're a conflict resolution organization. We're not a religious organization, but we look at this fact of faith and religion, and also the idea that a very tiny fraction of those people are ideologically or spiritually, religiously committed to conflict and division and violence. And we think, what can we do to identify and elevate the best of the values in human faith tradition and mobilize people around that driver of the way that they see the world to do good things, right? To, in our case, find ways to help mitigate violent conflict. So again, we elevate the aspects of spiritual conviction that emphasize things like care and compassion, understanding and healing in very, very practical and methodological ways around reconciliation, conflict transformation, things like that. And it manifests in a lot of different ways. And I'll give you a couple examples. One of the objectives of the organization, we have 4 core objectives. One of them is to remove religion as a driver of violence. And so one of the things that we're doing right now, because religion undeniably right now has some elements across faith traditions that are being used to divide and dehumanize and justify violence. And so one of the things we're doing, for example, is we've been working since 2011 on analysis of intolerance in the religious education in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And we are increasingly doing that in partnership with the Saudis themselves, because we are trying to acknowledge and support reform efforts that are going on in the kingdom at present. And so in our most recent study, we were able to send to the Saudis interim reports on what we were finding in the textbooks that we used a very rigorous methodology. And these were Islamic scholars doing this. It wasn't me doing this from my desk as a Irish, Italian, Bostonian, ex-Catholic Quaker. We had Islamic scholars and people who were familiar with not just the faith, but the context in the kingdom, pointing out where there was content that was contradictory to religious tolerance, and really was inspiring extremism in some cases. I mean, some of these texts are used by groups like ISIS when they held territory and were conducting religious education in that territory. So some of it can be pretty extreme. So that's one of the things we've been working on, and then the other 3 objectives really try to celebrate the positive in religious traditions. So we look to identify and train religious peacemakers where they exist. And so, for example, we worked in Colombia with religious women of faith, who were engaged in interfaith peace building, and we identified with them the need for reconciliation between former combatants that were demobilizing and being reintroduced into the communities, and the communities that were impacted by the violence. And this reconciliation was kind of a gap at the time in government programming with the demobilized combatants. And so we were training these women, many of whom themselves are victims of violence or come from communities that were very much impacted by the violence, to operate as reconcilers between these different groups. And honestly, they use their faith tradition to do that. And I know we're limited in time, but there's some great anecdotes about this where, they would come out and they would act out pageantry based on sacred texts in order to deepen their understanding of what their texts compel them to do when they themselves are faced with challenges.
It's one little
for example,
story.
as victims listening to
Tell
a little story.
Tell a story. Absolutely.
So we were one day we were having a dialogue between former combatants and these women that we were working with, women of faith. What's that?
Where was this? Whereabouts? Which country?
This is in Colombia.
Okay.
In Colombia. Yeah, in Colombia. So the majority of the women in that space were Christian. Some of them evangelical Christians, some Catholics. We did have some indigenous women in the group, but a group of the Christian women, we were having some real problems because the former combatants were not really very tactful about talking about the justifications for what they did, the violence that they engaged in. And these are delicate processes, and you're going to have setbacks, and things are not always going to go very well. So some of the women who had been victims of violence left the room. But then they came back, and we were staying in a convent to save on expenses, because as an NGO, we're always looking for ways to save money. And they came back dressed in bed sheets, and they started acting out the pageant from the Bible, the biblical story of the adulteress, who, people who are familiar with the Christian context will remember, was dragged through the streets and thrown in the dirt in front of Jesus. And Jesus then, pronounced his famous line of, "Let the one amongst you who has not sinned cast the first stone," if I can paraphrase. Mm-hmm. And then they sat there and they said, as followers, what do we have to understand about this? with respect to these people who have sinned in our mind
Mm-hmm.
and are now brought in front of us unwillingly, unrepentantly. And at the time, the government was one that was very much focused on persecuting the different armed actors, particularly the leftists. And so it was kind of like the biblical story where you've got the authorities around Jesus saying, you know, you have to follow the law and stone her. And they said, okay, well, there are some issues that we need to elevate here in terms of forgiveness, in terms of non-repetition, which is a very important part of the reconciliation process, because the next line that Jesus says, which is not as famous, is go now and do not sin again, right? So there's a non-repetition clause built in there. And it was fascinating to watch them work through their own personal challenges using their faith tradition. And not only did that help them, but it helped connect them more profoundly on reconciliation themes with the indigenous women who were in the room, who are not Christian, who have a different cosmovision, a different way of understanding things like punishment and restoration. But because they were able to articulate clearly the principles that undergirded the spirit of reconciliation for them through this cosmovision that was much more important to them than maybe the legal frameworks,
Right.
because it was their faith tradition. It allowed for a depth of connection in concepts and in practice that I think wouldn't be there otherwise. And this is one of the things that we at ICRD really adhere to, is the idea that, you know, faith can be a very powerful mobilizer for good or ill.
Because it's so deeply
and
embedded.
if you can tap it.
Yeah, faith or our religious sense or spirituality, however we describe it, is so deeply, it's just a part of our being. And so legal laws, they kind of come into being, and then they're adopted or not adopted. But yeah, I think the point there that you're making is that the potent nature on the agency of the individual, the impact on the individual, on their life, is powerful. Do you have any other?
Now it manifests in community too.
Right. So now, so that was in Colombia, and I know that
right. And so let me give a couple other quick examples.
Yeah, thank you.
One of the things we also do is we try to create more religious peace builders. And so in a place like Yemen, where the government effectively collapsed during the violence, we were working there just in the time leading up to the start of the war. And so we've been able to sustain operations there throughout the entire period of the war and the famine and the cholera outbreak and now COVID and all of these different effects or these different variables that have affected the violence there. And we've been working in rural communities. One of the things we've been doing is creating conflict resolution programs with religious and community and tribal leaders. And we've been going into the communities with our local partners and understanding what are the traditional practices that are being used there. How can they be amplified in a constructive way?
Right.
And also how can they be added to with maybe more contemporary Western perspectives on conflict resolution that are then framed within the culture, the faith, and the history of the space that we're working. And I'll give another example there is when we did a program in one community, they decided that the real issue for them was access to water. Now we're not a infrastructure organization, right? But we are a conflict resolution organization. And access to water was not only causing conflict between the communities, but it was undermining the leadership of the traditional actors there. And we thought, okay, we're in a place where the government has disappeared and cannot install these systems. The extremist groups then come in behind the government into these ungoverned spaces and offer social services to the communities in order to gain their trust and create an operating space for themselves. So you've got Al-Qaeda and you've got ISIS in Yemen that will come in and support communities. This is how they gain support. They don't come in and punish communities. There was an analysis done on some of their social media feeds at one point that said something like 75% of the social media content was about social needs, basic needs, and providing for basic needs in the communities. Something like 3% were about, Sharia judgments and legal issues that everybody thinks they're coming in and they're wielding a heavy hand in the communities around their ultra conservative interpretation of Islamic law. But it was a minimal thing that they were engaging with respect to that. And much more of their emphasis was on providing for social needs. So what we did was we empowered the local leaders to go out and bring in at-risk youth, some of whom were being actively recruited, some of whom frankly had left some of these extremist organizations already. And those youth installed the water systems that we supported. And in doing so, they were able to not only help the community, but they were able to create a sense of agency and empowerment for themselves in the face of crises, issues, or conflict issues. And they came out of that with an attitude that, they really felt like they had a positive role now in a place where they hadn't had one before. And many of them then said that they would reject the extremist groups and not allow them to come back in, and certainly not give them their support or join them after that. And in fact, they went on to raise their own money to go to neighboring communities to help them install water systems as well. So that's one of the things we're doing. And then the last objective really is to try to help break down the silo between religion and religious peacemaking and other forms of peacemaking. There's still a great deal of misunderstanding and even suspicion towards the religious space, right? And even those who know that it's important tend to silo it in the sense that they say, okay, well, we'll leave religion to the religious people.
Yeah. And
they can handle that with other stuff, development and sort of driven more by a realpolitik lens of international relations and promoting justice and development and things like that for our own political interests abroad, etc. But that has nothing to do with religion, and so we won't bring the religious in. So we're trying to bridge those differences, and one of the ways that we do that is we produce studies on some of the work that we do. And so we've been engaging ultra-conservative, exclusive faith communities in places where extremism is a problem. And we're hoping to try to do some of that work here in the United States now. But one of the examples I think of is in Tunisia, where we were talking to Salafi communities there who are nonviolent, and talking to the government and other actors who kind of paint the Salafi community with a broad brush, saying any Salafi is a risk for extremism and they want to undermine the government, etc. And we're trying to build an understanding of, okay, if you want to engage these folks in preventing violent extremism, because they are the people who have the ideology and the proximity to at-risk youth who are being recruited into these groups to go to Syria and other places, how then do you best understand these communities in a way that allows you to build those bridges? And then we produce, and I've got an airplane flying over, I'm sorry. So that may be causing some sort of background noise. But then we produce reports on that analyze, and we're not necessarily advocating for, we need to embrace Salafi groups. I realize there are lots of challenges around human rights issues, women's rights issues, when it comes to some ultra conservative communities, whether they're Salafi Muslims or whether they're, Buddhists or Christians or whatever it might be. I mean, this is not the purview of just one faith tradition. But we're not arguing necessarily to support their ideologies as much as we are saying that these are people who understand and have access to and can speak the language of people who are being actively recruited into violent extremist organizations. And if they can change the narratives and if they can use that ideology to actually undermine the extremist narratives, then that's something that we should understand. And And we should be able to be conversant with and have a relationship with these groups in order to advance this common interest of mitigating violence. And then we publish those reports, and we have those on our website if people are interested. And we try to inform policymakers.
So in putting it into a very, very simple, I'm oversimplifying things here, but when you go into a community, you look into that religion, you look into the workings of the community, and for the bigger picture of nonviolence, you look at what they're doing that is right, that is good. And not assuming that everything is, I mean, you don't want to necessarily magnify all the bad stuff, but you do want to notice what is being done right and to encourage more of that, right? I mean, it's kind of a simple way of looking at it, but that's part of what's going on.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I would add one more piece to that, which is, Thich Nhat Hanh, the engaged Buddhist, Vietnamese Buddhist, who is now, of course, been in France for many, many decades, but he talks of interbeing, right? And one of the understandings of interbeing, for me anyway, is this idea that we have what the Buddhists would call codependent arising. We are not isolated individuals or communities in this world. The way we function, the way our societies work has impact and ramifications and has been influenced by other societies and the way that they work. And that's true of individuals as well. And so I think this acknowledging that we all kind of belong to a system that functions like a web. And if, stealing from the Mennonite peacemaker, John Paul Lederach, if you pull on one piece of that web, one thread, the whole thing shifts. Mm-hmm. And so if you don't understand all of those interrelationships, that interbeing, then you're not going to have effective programming. I mean, we're just thinking this in terms of implementation and impact. If you want to have effective programming, you really need to be able to understand and evaluate the complexities of the dynamics. And so the only thing I would add to that is I would say, yes, we're trying to find the positive values in each faith tradition and community, but we're also trying to communicate those across difference and identity divides with positive values that are similar in other spaces, whether it be religious communities or not. And so a lot of what we do is try to identify and elevate common cause and common values. And now what usually happens, I realize, and I have some colleagues who will push back on me on this, but I realize there's some controversy around contact theory, but I'm actually still a fan of contact theory in the sense that I believe as people get to connect with one another and communicate with one another, if the interactions are positive, mm-hmm. Then they start to rehumanize one another, and they build empathy for one another despite differences. Mm-hmm. And once you do that, it's much harder to diminish, discriminate against, and even act violently towards another group. And so I think bringing in some of these conservative faith groups, which are deeply exclusive in their understanding of their faith tradition, many of which have kind of practices and doctrines that are in conflict with a Western human rights lens. I totally understand that. But I think as you bring them into communication with people that they wouldn't otherwise connect with, and they find common values and common cause, then you actually transition. You start to moderate their extremes, right? I'll tell a story a pastor friend of mine tells. He's a pastor in Dallas, Texas, in a mega church, evangelical mega church, and works very closely with the Muslim community on various different things of common interest, and does a lot of interfaith work. And he tells a story of a Muslim friend who went to watch a football game, American football game, and was in the stadium, and it became, it was time to pray. And so he snuck out and went back in, these cement corridors where they're selling beer and everything, and he figured out which way Mecca was, and he put his prayer rug down and he started to pray. And as he was finishing up, he felt a presence behind him. And he turned around, and there's this enormous American dude with the beard and his, I think it was the Philadelphia Eagles shirt on, and he's staring at him. And he asked him, he says, "You a Muslim?" And the guy said, "Yeah." He said, "I don't like Muslims. Everything I've heard about them. But you're also an Eagles fan?" And he said, "Yeah." And he goes, "All right, well, I can appreciate that. So maybe I need to change my attitude about Muslims," right? And so it's this idea that as people find these different identity markers that connect them, it can break down these barriers. The writer Amartya Sen has a book called Identity and Conflict. I think that's the title of it anyway. And he talks in there about how the singularity of identity, as we reduce ourselves down to just being a thing, it is so much easier than to other groups. It's so much easier to define ourselves as who we're not, right? At least I'm not that group, or at least I'm not that group, whether it be race, ethnicity, religion, whatever it might be, politics. As that becomes a singular focus of our identity, it really creates the conditions for conflict. And so one of the things that you can do to reduce conflict is multiply identity markers, right? Get people to realize, okay, I'm not just a gang member, but I'm also a father, I'm also a soccer player, I'm also part of the PTA, I'm also part, whatever it might be. And in doing that, they start to realize, well, I can't really be against other people who are connected to me those ways, right? And it changes people's behaviors.
You brought it yourself back to this topic of identity, which I think is so fundamental to your work, and which is very interesting in the context of American politics at the moment. So how do you see even the work that you do, the track that you usually follow in your work with people? Can you see any relevance to what is going on in America, and what would be some of the things that you would put out there as recommendations for action to people who, we see the politics, we see the divide, we see the identification, the narrowing identification going on. What would you recommend for today, for 2020, as we're moving into election times even? This is, I don't think what you're talking about has relevance only for the caves in Afghanistan or the jungles of Colombia or Yemen or anywhere else, but to life wherever human beings may be. So I'd like to hear something.
No, you're absolutely right. Yeah, and ICRD is actually making a domestic pivot right now for pretty much the first time in the history of the organization. We had a very small countering Islamophobia program a few years back that came out of some work we did with Pakistanis and Americans around religious identity. But we're actually looking now to get very involved in the question of radicalization here in this country, whether it be sort of reciprocal prejudices among different groups and how that spirals into more and more extreme othering and exclusion, and even calls for legal or extra legal discrimination, or whether it's really extremist groups here in the United States, from white supremacists to jihadis. We have people who have come out of those spaces who are helping us understand what we can do to kind of bring people away from those extremes. And so we hope to get very involved in that here in the United States. But honestly, what I would say, I think what we've seen recently more and more, and this is true across the world, but here in the States in particular, is a kind of schizophrenia in religion. I would say religion, if I can simplify it, kind of falls into two categories of understanding the divine and then what the divine is calling humans to do. And one of those categories, I would say, is that the divine has chosen a single group above all others, and those who are outside of that group not only fail to have any positive spiritual identity at all, because they are failing to embrace a capital T truth, but therefore they're entirely outside of the care and compassion of the divine and his or her followers, right? And so people say, my God hates such and such a group, and therefore I have to behave in such a way against them to be faithful to my God, right? I mean, the writer Anne Lamott actually has a kind of a great quote, which is, you can be fairly certain that it's something like, I'm paraphrasing, you can be fairly certain you have created God in your own image if God hates all the same people, right? And then there's a second understanding of faith, I think, which is, again, to simplify, most faith traditions kind of believe in the divine as a creative force, a creator force, and creation where we are. And the second understanding, I think, is one in which the creator calls on us to help and heal and elevate the positive in creation, right? And that includes caring for creation, including all other human community. So looking for what is good in, connecting to what is good in, elevating what is good in, helping to create healing and wholeness in communities that are not like us. And so you see a strain in faith where people are being compelled by their religious tradition and their doctrines and their belief to go out and find and encounter the other, the one who is different from them, the neighbor, if you want to use, Christian language, and connect to them in ways that, the Jesuits, to go back to the beginning of our conversation, would say manifests the kingdom in the world. How do you bring what is good into the world? Because frankly, I don't think hatred and egregious violence are characteristics of the divine. I think it's quite the opposite, right? Those are kind of the base elements of human nature. Mm-hmm. So I think, yeah, it's a hard time. There's no doubt. It's a hard time globally. It's a hard time here in the domestic space. It's really easy to get down and to look around and see so many things that are against us and that are breaking down social cohesion, that are destroying the middle ground that I think, is necessary for communication across difference. It's very easy to get depressed about this. But I think if you look closely, particularly at the community level, the backlash to that is that there are people who are now reaching out to folks that they've never talked to before. They're finding commonality with people that don't look or think anything like them because they're seeing the dangers associated with this kind of polarization and the politicization of that polarization and the politicization of identity, like religious identity. And I would just say, for me, there's all of these dichotomies of faith. If you're a religious believer, then you're one political stripe or whatever it might be. These are false dichotomies, right? And honestly, the whole American experiment is about breaking down polarities. The whole idea of the republic and the democracy in which we exist is, how do we create systems that don't unify people's identities and their thinking and their values, but create a way to communicate across those differences constructively. And those systems are what are at risk. I see, the Congress is polarized now, and there's no communication across the aisle there. Even the justice system, we're watching the breakdown. Media objectivity is gone to a large measure. We're watching the breakdown of the most important part of the American experience, which is not what policy we want, but it's the structures that allow us to debate and negotiate across difference in ways that then bring out the best for the community. And that's what's at risk. So we hear a lot of people talking about our way of life. I would contend that is our way of life. And it needs to be sustained, and it needs to be healed, and it needs to be restored. And there are people out there trying to do it. And I think we need to look for those folks and those examples to give ourselves hope.
And beyond finding those other people to give us hope, what would be one thing that you would recommend to each person? in your experience with all of the work that you've done, recognizing that, you know, being in those rooms where victims walk out and other perpetrators are still there and you're still trying to keep them all together to talk, what would be one request that you would make of left, right, victim, perpetrator, whatever, you know, across the aisle? What is the one thing that in those moments, you don't give people a whole slew of steps to take? You ask them, please just, what do you say to people in those moments? What would you say to Americans who are, you know, split across, you know, there's more of a chasm instead of just a means of communication? What simple step?
Yeah, well, you know, there are a couple of core values that I think are really important, and among them, I would say, are patience, compassion, and humility. There's a Jewish ethical tradition text that's called the Pirkei Avot, and I think it translates to the wisdom of our fathers or something like that. And there's a statement in there that goes along the lines of, you know, we are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are we free to desist from it, right? So I think this idea of patience and humility, you know, these things take time. And if you don't go into a challenge knowing that you probably are wrong about some perception you have of that challenge, you're probably wrong about some perception you have of the other, and you are probably actually going to have to change yourself while you are trying to make social change. If you don't have those attitudes and you come in with rigid perceptions and you come in expecting things to happen like that, you will be disappointed. And frankly, even in the peace building world, I've seen people, you know, hoping to solve conflict, and you can get burned out, and you can you know, ultimately become embittered and maybe even do more damage than good. I think we have to recognize that these kinds of human conflicts and crises are part of what it means to be human, right? We've made so many great technological advances as a species. It's incredible to think what we have done in the last 100 years. I mean, just think through where we've gone, even in our lifetimes, in terms of computing and telephones and all the other stuff that, you know,
yeah, I mean,
what was that?
I said just in 10 or 11 years, we never used to have this.
Yeah, it's extraordinary.
There's more power in our pockets than ever.
And yet at the same time, that's right. But at the same time, every generation has to be retaught things like compassion, care, not to discriminate, not to be selfish, not to destroy things for their own interests, right? I mean, these are things we have to teach our kids every generation. And frankly, you know, that's part of the human experience. And so this is cyclical work. It is not work that takes you from point A to point B and then you're done. This is work that you are going to do in one place, and then it's going to erupt somewhere else. You're going to have to go there and do it. And you may have to go back to the place you were a minute ago and get re-engaged, right? And if you don't have that kind of patience and the hope that implies, and I'm not talking about passive hope where you sit back and want the world to change and hope someone comes along and changes it. I'm talking about active hope, where you engage the world thinking that it can be different, right? Thinking that you can transform spaces. Again, with humility, that's hugely important, because to go in thinking you've got the answers usually can cause more problems. But to go in and think that together with whomever you're working, you can find solutions to co-create. That's a great term. Again, interbeing, right? We are arising in a codependent fashion. How do we do that in ways that solve problems, that create systems that then can deal with future problems, because they are not going to evaporate? And I think, unfortunately, a lot of what we see in identity crises, identity conflicts, are these rigid positions. It's either my way or the highway, and that's it. It's either I get what I want or you get what you want.
Because
it's a win-lose situation. This all goes back to Urian Fisher's famous book on, getting to yes. How do you move to a win-win idea of conflict? We create a new system or structure that actually serves both of us better than the ones that exist now. And unfortunately, I don't see enough of that attitude out there. But sorry, go ahead.
So, not a problem. We're getting around to our hour. It's gone so quickly. But I've just got a couple more things before we close out. First of all, I would like to thank you for taking the time to tell us your stories. And I know that what you have observed, what you've facilitated and enabled is really remarkable work. And I think at this time, the whole focus that you just brought us to at the end there, that what we are doing, we have to look at the human element of all of our technological growth, our societal amazing changes in society. But yes, we do. We have to be born. We have to learn how to walk. We have to learn how to speak. We have to learn how to relate. And even with all of those things in place, we still haven't necessarily learned compassion, understanding, the willingness to challenge ourselves. So there are all of these things that often sound hard. Can you tell us one thing that you find that you can give us the hope for excitement, interest, surprise? What's something surprising, about all of this that you didn't expect to find? Because I think one of the things that human beings respond to, it's a fundamental emotion of ours, is surprise, for better and for worse. But we like gifts, we like birthday cakes, we like to be, paid attention. What is something that is surprising in all of this work that can help make the challenges of it more engaging, interesting, enjoyable, dare I say?
Yeah, well, honestly, the only thing that comes right to mind is just the capacity of the human heart. I mean, you are very kind to say that the work that we're doing is remarkable, and I do have an extraordinary team. But I'll tell you, the real heroes of this work are the people who are in these communities, who have every reason to be broken, have every reason to be despairing, have every reason to be angry, and to be seeking vengeance and retribution and contributing to conflict. And yet they'll stand in the face of these crises, and through their faith, whatever that faith might be, and we work with people of no faith as well, and so it's not necessarily just religious faith, they will see that something is possible that's not obvious right in front of you, and they will commit themselves entirely, body, spirit, and soul and energy and everything to making that happen. And I have stood with and danced with and read poetry with and cried with people. I think of one particular, a nun in Colombia, who at the end of a 3-day session got up and laughed and said, well, now I got to go back home, where the paramilitaries just knocked on my door for the 3rd time and said, you're not hearing us. If you continue to do this work, we will kill you. And I just stared at her stunned, and she's got to be in her 70s, right? And Colombia is one of the scariest places to try to do peace building or any kind of pro-social work, because there is a lot of killing that happens there of people working in this field, and you never hear their stories, and they're never sung, but they're out there quietly doing this incredible work. And she laughed at me when I expressed my concerns, and she said, if they were really going to kill me, they wouldn't tell me. And off she went. And so there are real heroes in the human community, and these are our fellow humans. It's not that they're other, they're not some species beyond our comprehension. They are suggestive of who we could be, right? And so we can just be open to absorb and learn from and be inspired by what is possible that other human beings have shown us that we as a species, as a community, are capable of. And so it's out there, and it's not always easy to find, but every time I see that, it takes away 100 other examples of hatred and violence and destructiveness that we can engage in. So it's possible. We've shown that it's possible. We've lived it. That I think is a real source of inspiration.
Well, in order to just close out our time together, is there anything you would like to invite anybody who's listening to this to do? I know that we're putting on the page below, there's a link to your report. There'll be a way for people to connect if they've got questions through email. Is there anything else that you would like to say, invite people to?
Yeah, actually, we have an upcoming Faith in Action Award dinner, which is our annual gala, and it will be virtual this year because of the COVID issues. It was originally scheduled for May, and it'll now be in October. And people can get on our website, can reach out to our communications officer, our director of communications and development, Nick Acosta. And his email is quite easy. It's nick@icrd.org, and get more details on that. We'll be celebrating this year the work, among other things, the work of Karenna Gore, who is a theologian and environmental activist up at Union Theological Seminary. And so, yeah, I'd encourage people to check it out, and if they're interested in being a part of that, join us.
Wonderful. Well, I just have to say thank you so much, James, for taking the time. I noticed that you're kind of hanging out in your backyard in your hammock, and I asked you about that, and you said before that it was in order to be in a quieter space. It's a little bit, these are COVID times and unusual for all of us. But just really quickly before we close out, where did you get that hammock? And this is not an ad.
Well, this hammock came back. No, it came back with me from the country of Colombia. I'm a big fan of the siesta culture that got in my blood after 20 years of work in Latin America. And frankly, I have it hanging out here on our front porch, and I used it to kind of take a break now and again from my stand-up desk in my office. And then one day, by mistake, I brought my computer with me, and I just haven't left it since. So this is my new office. It's a little bit indulgent, but you're right. I have 2 young kids that are bouncing off the walls inside probably. So it makes it a little easier to have these kinds of conversations.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to spend this time with us.
Thanks.
It's been just a delight. And I look forward, to hearing from you again.
Likewise, I really appreciate it, and the fact that you're supporting and interested in what we're doing. I'm deeply grateful. Thanks for taking the time to have me talk about what we're up to and what we're trying to do. So much appreciated, Karen.
We are honored. Thank you very much. you.